Yuan Shan, Elegy number 1. Like Duke Xie's youngest, most beloved daughter, you married me, a poor Chin Lo, and our life was hard. When I had nothing to eat, you hunted through our hamper. When I had no wine, you pawned your golden pins. You foraged wild plants and sweet bean shoots for us to eat, found dead leaves for fuel, watching old scholar trees for their fall. Today I am rich, 100,000 a year, and all I can do is leave these offerings for your soul. So we continue with heptasyllabic regulated poems, and we come now to the poems of Yuan Shan. Now, Yuan Shan has 4 poems in this anthology, therefore he's in the Bronze League, and this is the first of his poems in the anthology. He has 3 right now in a row, all on the same subject, that is elegies based on his departed wife and lamenting the early death of his first wife, at least. And, he has 3 here, and then he has 1 later on. Now, who was Yuan Shan? Now, Yuan Shan is a mid-Tang poet. He basically excelled and became famous in the first half of the 9th century. Now, Yuan Shan was a descendant of an imperial dynasty, the Tuoba, who during the period of disunion had been the emperors of the northern part of China, basically through the second half of the 5th century and the early years of the 6th. And they had later Sinicized themselves and adopted a Chinese surname, Yuan. Yuan Shen was from a family of officers and from Luoyang. He became a close friend of Bai Yuji. They would be inseparable. They prepared for the examinations together and passed them together, Yuan Shen taking first place. And after that, he had a series of different positions in the court, generally in the mid-range, with many provincial governorships and the like. But during the reign of Emperor Muzong, he actually managed for a brief period of time to become one of the chancellors. So you could say that Yuan Shen is in the league of the very few Tang dynasty poets who actually did manage to rise to the highest posts of the bureaucracy and the administration, in the same league as Chang Yue or Zhang Yuling. And he was rather more successful, as I say, than his best friend, or Bai Yuji, and even though Bai Yuji is now more famous than him and has more importance, in his own day, Yuan Shen was more successful as a Confucian scholar. And today, his poetry is not, I believe, is not that much appreciated. He is mostly famous for a short story, Chuan Qi, that he wrote, the story of Jing Jing, about a scholar official and who gets into a love relation with a woman. And, this story was later adapted into opera and other poems. And there's, I think it's a Ming Dynasty opera, The Story of the Western Wing, which is an elaboration of the story of Jing Jing, which is one of the great classics of Chinese literature, one of the top 4 or 5 plays in the whole of the Chinese literary tradition, probably. Okay, so moving back to Yuan Shan then, a rather successful scholar official, he writes here the first of a group of 4 poems in which he laments the death of his wife. This is we haven't encountered many poems like this in the anthology, but this is a pretty conventional topic, even if it might be genuinely felt by Yuan Shan. The most famous poems on lamenting a wife's early death were from the period of the Eastern Jin, I think. So late 200s, early 300s, by Pan Yue, I think, is the poet who composed famous poems about his deceased wife. So the topic is pretty clear. It's lamenting a virtuous and good woman's disappearance. There's also a sub-theme. Most of the poem is basically an encomium, a series of examples of the well-deserved praise of Yuan Shan's deceased wife. There's also an element of contrasting Yuan Shan's current prosperity with his past poverty, especially in the last couplet, which unfortunately his wife was not able to enjoy. Okay, then, so as usual, let's take a look at this poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. Like Duke Xie's youngest, most beloved daughter, you married me, a poor Chin Lo, and our life was hard. So the first couplet already starts with one or two cryptic references which I have been at pains to discover. Like Duke Xie's youngest, most beloved daughter, you married me, a poor Chin Lo, when our life was hard. You know, it's using a historical or a couple of historical exempla to establish the main idea to start the poem. Yuan Shan was poor and he married a woman from a good family. Now, as to the anecdotes, Chin Lo, the reference to Chin Lo, or rather to Chin Lo's wife, is included in one of the classical texts of the Han dynasty, the Eastern Han, I think. The Lienu Chuan, the biographies of exemplary women, where in the second section, Worthy and Enlightened Women, there's a story about this woman, the wife of Qian Lo. Nothing much is explained of her except that that she married a very poor man, a man who led an austere life, and it explains that when her husband died, she demonstrated her virtue and that she was content in living with him. But I think this the wife of Chin Lo is not Duke Xie's youngest and most beloved daughter. I think the first line, I'm not clear, but it's probably a reference to a poet we've talked about, Ling Yung, the Duke of Kangle, was one of the great poets of the period of disunion, and I imagine there is some obscure anecdote in a book I have not read about his youngest daughter marrying a person who was not rich. Anyway, the image is pretty clear. Even if it's expressed with these two pretty dark references. So Yuan Shan married a woman from a good background, just like Duke Xie's daughter married a poor scholar, and just as Qin Lo's wife was married to a poor scholar and led, as a consequence, a tough life. Second couplet. Now, both the second and the third couplet describe, you could say, the difficulties that Yuan Shan and his wife experienced and how she basically helped the couple to deal with them in the best possible way. When I had nothing to wear, you hunted through our hamper. When I had no wine, you pawned your golden pins. So the emphasis in the second couplet is when the husband was lacking some things, it was she who provided for him, which is rather unusual. I mean, man is the provider in traditional Chinese culture, evidently. But here the role is inversed. She gets clothes for him, and she sells her own jewelry so that he might drink, which, sounds like a rather frivolous way of spending their poor savings into her husband's caprices. And the third couplet continues in the same line, but it seems to focus more than on the extravagant pleasures or things for the benefit of Yuan Shan, on the satisfaction of basic needs of the couple, like eating and warming, getting warm. Yeah, you foraged wild plants and sweet bean shoots for us to eat, found dead leaves for fuel, watching old scholar trees for their fall. So the same idea as in the previous couplet, but again, as I insist here, the needs that are being described seem to be more essential than those of the previous couplet, as opposed to clothes, although clothes are necessary, and wine. Here we get food and fuel for keeping the house warm. Well, you could actually say that they're all equally important. But anyway, these four lines all put the focus on the same thing, as I said. The woman was a good provider for the household at a time when Yuan Shan was not, because he was poor and he was probably studying for the examinations and, not being able to get much or in the way of revenue. Finally, the last couplet brings us back to the present and intensifies the paradox that this woman, who was the provider of Yuan Shan when he was poor, is no longer around. So now Yuan Shan has to symbolically provide her. He cannot do it because she's dead. The only thing he can do is, at the funerary services or at the time of the year when the dead are homaged and sacrificed to, he can leave some offerings for his departed wife. And that's the best he can do. He can never pay back this wonderful woman and her generosity and selflessness. So today I am rich, 100,000 a year, and all I can do is leave these offerings for your soul. As we said at the beginning of the introduction to this poem, Yuan Shan was actually very successful in the civil service and in the bureaucracy, rising to positions of power and wealth. But alas, all that came too late for his unhappy and worthy wife. So, quite a sad, melancholy poem, and the topic will be replayed at least twice in the next two poems that we are going to read, which are, again, elegies on the departed wife.